It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. It is 7:09. Stephen Arms, historian, is with us. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Doug.
And how are you today on Washington's real birthday?
Oh, I'm fine. I've been surviving this week. I've been doing some building in my house. So, but I came through. I got paint on my hands.
Oh,
still.
geez. Oh, okay. You've been a busy guy then.
Yeah, this week. Yeah, I closed in one of my patio in the back and made it into a storage area.
So, are you kind of a handyman?
I had a friend help me. I mean, I can do basic stuff, but
okay.
I was good. But if you want somebody who has to cut the measures and frame the walls, I'm a real good nail pounder. But you know, it was good.
That's how I am too. I'm a worker bee. Then Yeah. Okay, what do I need to do?
If you tell me how to do it, I can do it. But yeah, it was kept me busy this week. Actually, my daughter's down and she's a teacher in Seattle, but she was here and the weather was good, so she actually helped me paint yesterday.
Well, my dad was a very good mechanic, but as a carpenter, not everything was always exactly plumb, and so he built this back porch at our house, and a tank could have hit it, and probably the porch would still be standing. But when you looked at it, everything was just a little askewed, And next door neighbor was a carpenter, and he was always razzing my dad about, well, don't you fix my car like you built your porch, that kind of stuff.
Well, I can understand that. Well, my house was built in 1900 originally.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, there's a lot of it that when you go around and look at, it's well made.
Yeah.
It has tongue and grooves walls and all that. But there's a lot of it. When you measure something, you'll go, yeah, you'd be surprised in 117 years how much things shift slightly.
Sure.
And problems with it. We were doing that, noticing that with the porch, going, wow, this is just different sizes here because of 100 years of work.
Yeah, and settling and all sorts of things that happen.
Hope after 117 years, I think I'm going to probably be shifted too. I mean, one way or the other. So
now, wasn't Washington kind of a Renaissance man? I mean, the women loved him because evidently he was real handsome. He was a military leader.
Washington was generally, when they think of Renaissance man, people always think of Jefferson because he had so many different things that he covered. But Washington one was tall. He was 6'3", and in the time we're talking about, he was one of the tallest men you'll ever run into. I mean, 6'3" is reasonably tall now, but back then,
right?
He was huge.
Oh yeah.
And one of the interesting things about him is that everybody had their powdered wigs and stuff. Washington didn't have a powdered wig. Washington's hair was his hair. He was actually a ginger when he was a young man, that reddy brown. And when he got older, when they got in their 40s, they would powder their wigs, or in his case, he had to powder his hair.
To make him look older?
They did that because it made people look more. They thought it made people look more mature. They'd actually the opposite of today. Rather than dyeing your hair, they would want to be considered to be more worldly and wiser with their years. And he was a good student. I mean, in school he stayed in school till he was 16, and he ended up going as and then he became a surveyor. And he actually went out because his family only had so much money at the time, and he couldn't go to school anymore after that. And he worked as an actual surveyor, going the Western Territories at that point. Of course, that's going to be, Pennsylvania and places back then. But he did that for quite a few years before he got involved in other politics and stuff. But yeah, a really good man, very popular. And the thing about Washington that's fascinating is he wasn't a great politician. He wasn't a great military man, and he wasn't a great, thinker, but great military men, great thinkers, and all listened to him. I mean, Ben Franklin listened to him and respected him, and Franklin is brilliant. Jefferson's, is a great politician, yet he deferred to Washington on these matters. Well,
during the Revolutionary War, he was kind of a trickster. He'd pull tricks out, out of his hat. So
well, he had to because he was dealing with. Remember, I mean, he was made general of the Continental Army, and there wasn't a Continental Army at that point. There was just militias from various states. And again, his military career goes before that, of course, because Washington is interesting because he fought both against the British and with the British. Because in the French and Indian Wars, when he was a colonel, and he fought against the French on the side of the Crown. And
so then he was a British soldier then?
Right.
Was he an officer at that time as well?
He was a colonel, but he was a colonel in the American forces working under the British forces. And that was, of course, the problem. And the big one that people on that one, I think, if you want to talk about George Washington, maybe it kind of sets his character, is that in in the Ohio River Valley, there's the French had a fort, which is Fort Desquenay, and the Americans the Crown, the British, built a fort at the other end, Fort Necessity, and there was an attack against Desquenay, and it was moderately successful. Then they had, on the way back, they were attacked by French forces, mostly native forces, and George Washington he sent the troops and was toward the end of the battle to keep what was going on, and actually was moving along. Generally generals get leaders get in the front. Mm-hmm. He was one of these ones that he was with his men, and he had his horse shot out from under him, and they put him on another horse. And then when they looked at his uniform,
and holes in it,
it had scorch marks, 4 of them, four balls, powdered ball. You're talking about flintlocks, and holes in it or scorch marks. In the wool went through. It's just it was an amazing tribute to his character.
Let's go to our listener line. Hi, you're on the air.
Happy birthday, George. Sir, I have a question about. I have my great grandpa's Civil War, kind of like a copy of his Civil War enlistment papers. Mm-hmm. And can you explain sometime today about volunteer? He took somebody's place. I forget what it's called. He was like a volunteer substitute.
You're talking during the Civil War. You had an option that if you had to either show up for service or you could pay the government enough to hire somebody else. And the terms are skipping my mind.
Okay,
skipping my
so
mind
he was
too.
Somebody else.
Yeah. So in other words, he was he was probably a poor guy who needed the money, so they gave him the money to go fight in the Civil War. I would imagine. Because that's what most of them did.
That's not a very good deal.
It isn't. Not when you consider the amount. The Civil War, we lost more people than all of our other wars combined.
Right.
Or pretty close.
And that doesn't include all the injuries along the way.
Oh yeah, and then the injuries were like we're talking. Well, again, it's hard to call Civil War exactly, but 700,000 dead, mostly killed.
Yeah.
A goodly portion killed. So. I know something about, was it your great-grandfather, you said?
I believe it was. They called him Uncle Rich. I have his picture, and my dad went to, I think, Manassas and went to his grave and found him and got some paperwork about him. But he got this copy of these enlistment papers, and it's really funny. You'd swear he was a horse or something being sold because all the things he could do in his health and it's really interesting. It's hard to read the thing, but it's just interesting how it was written. And he was very poor. They were from Pound, Virginia. They were dirt poor coal miners. And I just
so was he your great grandfather? Because
my dad died a couple years ago. He was 90.
Okay,
my dad was. So it would have
great grandfather.
Okay,
it would be my dad's great grandpa.
Because my great grandfather was let's see, Irvin McDowell, General.
Well, my dad was born in 26, so his grandpa would have been. Oh no, because he went in 1864. That was the date on the papers.
Right. Okay, and he would have to have been. And again, depending on the Civil War, he could have been 16. I mean, they took that without a problem, but at that point. But
right.
Generally, you were still supposed to be, most of them were 18
I'll have to
as
do the
a
math. Anyway, very interesting to actually see that document. Most people would never. It's just interesting is all. I was just curious about the substitute part. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, it was a great. They called it the Great Skedaddle. It was the first Battle of Bull Run.
Oh yeah, the first Battle of Bull Run.
Yeah, and he was basically a militia with some troops. But he had to fight Confederates that had already been in battle numerous times, and so that was a great skedaddle. And I've got relatives in not Arkansas, in Oklahoma, and they say, he was a chicken, all that. And I was like, but I read into it, and he just was outgunned, outmanned. And,
well, I mean, again, standing there and dying to the man, isn't going to do anything for winning your victories.
And he was the first general fired by Abraham Lincoln.
That's true. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, there were plenty to fire at that point because again, there was a lack of a lot of them didn't have a lot of experience actually on the field. I always thought was an interesting twist, if you're going to get a Civil War fact, is that Robert E. Lee, of course, is probably the main reason the Civil War if Lee had not become leader of the Confederate Army, the war would have probably lasted a few months because Robert E. Lee was brilliant.
Oh yes, very much so.
During the Mexican War, there was when the Americans were going south and they're seizing the capital, They had to go through a mountain pass, and the Mexicans had set up mortars there to ambush them, and they knew they were there, but you had to go there to get through. And one of the officers had began talk to the locals and found out there was a pass above the Mexican position, and he got people to lead him up there, and they set up some mortars and rained down on theirs and chased him out. It was a captain in the United States Army who was Captain Robert E. Lee.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, even back then, you're looking at Lee and going, "This is a brilliant
military strategist."
He always was. I mean, and sometimes people go, "Well, he fought on the side of the South." Yeah, but Lee didn't own slaves. And again, in the Civil War, 90% of people in the South did not own slaves.
And my understanding is that Lincoln, or who was ever in power at that time, I think it was Lincoln, would have preferred or asked him to be one of his generals.
Lincoln asked him; he would have given him control of the army. They called the Army of the Potomac. Mm-hmm. He would have given him command of it, but he didn't. He didn't because it wasn't because of the South, as he supported Virginia, and when Virginia seceded, Lee wouldn't fight against his own homeland.
Right.
And and because of that,
that's a tough decision to make when you think about it.
It is. It is because Robert E. Lee didn't really care. Like I said, people. We can do a whole show sometime on the Civil War. But the Civil War is people go, well, what's the cause of the Civil War? I go, the short answer is slavery. But it is more complicated than that. There are economic factors. There are territorial issues. There's states' rights issues. There's a whole bunch of things that adds together. But if you took slavery out of the mix, you'd have probably negotiated the rest of them.
I know in the Ken Burns documentary they go over General Lee and how he had to make this decision and things, and then some of the generals he went to West Point with, he was fighting against
and kicking their butts.
Yeah,
I mean, because until you actually got a general who was willing to stand his ground, mm-hmm. I mean, most of the Confederates only got to see the back of the Yankees uniforms.
It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. 7:22 is the time. Historian Stephen Arms is our guest, and we have a listener on the line. Hi, you're on the air.
Yeah, I was in the bedroom where Robert E. Lee made that decision, and very small room, and they said he spent most of the night figuring it out.
So when did you visit this?
Oh, it's been a while, but I know he's the cemetery was his property.
Right.
Yeah. Something else that's interesting, Doug, when you talk about the North and the South, from his house, you can see the Capitol building. So the South and the North are really not very far apart.
No. The D.C. is kind of almost like in the South, isn't it, Virginia?
Well, it is. I mean, and the weird part, I mean, like I said, we should do a whole show on the Civil War. Let's talk about Washington, but it would be. But that's one of the reasons when the war got started, the North was suddenly panicky because that army's not that far away.
No.
And again, in 1812, the War of 1812, we'd had people. I mean, the Capitol was actually burned in 1812, so it's not like people had never seen the city being attacked.
Yeah, tell me if I'm right. After Lee lost, they took his property, and then they turned it into a cemetery. I don't think that he sold it to him. I think they took it.
I actually don't remember that one. I don't remember on the confiscation of his property. I know that most Southerners had issues because there were financial issues that had to be done because, again, Lee didn't own slaves, so I mean, it didn't have the compensation of that, which was a huge burden for the ones who had to give.
And the irony is it's the Republicans that freed the slaves, and now they're called the racist ones. All right, I'll get out of the politics.
That's true.
All right, thank you.
You bet. Bye-bye. Okay, they're gone. All right, I had another call, but call back. Of course, if you want to call in and don't have our number or haven't put it in your speed dial, 360-533-5259.
So, and speaking of putting out numbers, I guess it's time for me to put out my YouTube channel is Arena of History, ARENA of History, and you can look me up there. It's strange. I mean, I post our broadcast there, and I pull the commercials out so people want to listen to them. And then I'm going to be doing. I have a piece I'm going to be doing later on this week on just what is socialism, what is communism. People often want to talk about it, but they don't really know what they don't. Generally speaking, most of the people in the news media and most of our politicians don't even have an idea of what they're talking about. So I'm going to do a piece on that. And I did an article relating to that in the Senior Sunset Times. I got to get my plugs in, I guess.
Sure, I don't care.
Yeah, so When you're talking about Washington, though, again, the expression for Washington, first in peace, first in war, first in the hearts of his countrymen. He was a very charismatic man. People just loved him. And if Washington probably had been supportive of the Constitution, I think we'd have probably had something different. Because, I mean, literally his voice had that much authority at the time. When he was actually elected as President of the United States, he has one that nobody can argue with because he got 100% of the electoral votes. Was pretty much that they sent their representatives and they said all in favor, aye, and everyone put up their hand, all opposed, no, and that was it. I mean, because it was like he was the only logical choice that most people were thinking about at the time. I made up a little list because I was thinking about this. We were talking about this today, and kind of unusual facts about George Washington, and we were talking about this earlier, is he didn't have a middle name. I mean, you mentioned, I think your dad didn't.
No.
Yeah. So, I mean, but it's unusual in America, most people have a middle name. I guess George Washington was enough for him. He was an honorary citizen of France. The French, after the war, made him a citizen of France. Even Jefferson didn't have that, despite the fact that he lived there all that time. He was, during John Adams' term, it's unusual, he was the only non-president who was put in as commander-in-chief. During Adams' administration, there were some issues going on, and Washington, this is, of course, is 18... So
they made Washington commander-in-chief.
They made him commander-in-chief. Now, he was fairly old at the time, so it was more honorary, but he was a non-president commander-in-chief.
So it's old back then. I mean, he was like in his late 50s or early 60s. Yeah. Would that be because I guess the average age, if you go back, say 100, 110 years, 120 years, was 46.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have somebody on the...
Hi, you're on the air.
Hi, good morning, Doug. Good morning to your guest.
Hi.
Quick comment. The old-timers, Washington and all them guys that created our Constitution after our War of Independence from England were really a smart bunch of guys to create a republic like they did that has lasted so many years. And it would make you wonder if they had went to a democracy, how that would have affected our Civil War. And I'll listen to your comments off the phone. Thank you.
Well, most of the ones, when you look at the concept of democracy, I mean, probably one of the big scholars, Franklin, of course, and Jefferson were two scholars that talked about this a lot. And again, there's Adams and a bunch of others too. There is a lot of brilliant people because they studied what had happened before in the ancient world. But Jefferson, referred to democracy as mobocracy. Because the idea, and I think if we had actually tried to have a real democracy, it becomes a tyranny of the masses. Because I mean, then what you almost how do you if people always make a majority decision on that, we can say majority rules, but you need to create a parameter of laws to say, again, in the United States, if I take a vote in the United States right now and had everybody want to vote for a religion for the United States, well, majority of people in the United States are Christians. So logically, Christianity would be the religion of the United States if we were a democracy. And anybody, and of course, that's why, again, we have the idea of, freedom of religion is part of a fundamental tenet of the Constitution. I think most of them were smart enough to realize that and in modern times we get a little of that now. Well, the people have their voice. Well, sometimes the people don't know what the heck they're talking about, and they need to actually look. They don't do the research to get it to try to get it right.
You can see how people will get revved up about something, and then months later find out they were totally off.
They're wrong. Yeah. That's all there is to.
Yep. Well, we're going to take our bottom of the hour break, and then we'll be back with historian Stephen Arms. If you have any comments or questions once we're out of our break, give us a call 360-533-5. It's KBKW's Coffee Talk at 7:37, and Stephen Arms, historian, is our guest today, and we've been talking about George Washington and about a little bit about the Civil War and just in general some of the things that happened over the past where we had to get in some heavy duty conflicts.
Oh yeah,
and we did.
Well, like you said, in Washington's case, I mean, in military aspects, one thing is that Washington, when in 1976, actually, they actually posthumously made a change in George Washington's rank, and they made him General of the Armies of the United States, which means there's no star on that. That's just, you are the general of the Army of the United States. So he would have been he was the highest ranking officer ever. The only thing above him had authority over him would have been the President of the United States.
So what kind? So because I think if they don't have 5-star generals? Did they have 5-star generals?
I don't think 5-star, 4-star was
4-star. I think that's what I thought. So in other words, this would be the equivalent of a 5-star general.
Exactly. It would be like even more than say Eisenhower as a supreme commander. It's just saying that that this was the person that was in charge of all the armies in the United States. He would technically be able to give, if you look at that rank, he'd be able to give orders to Marines, Navy, Air Force, everybody. And that was just a matter of honoring, because a lot of the military commented about that when they were talking about it at the time, because Washington in a lot of ways set the standards of what a soldier was really supposed to do. I mean, he was very brave, devoted to his men. And the strange thing about it is, people say, well, devoted to his men and all that, and they go Valley Forge and the hordes and all that. But Washington in his life, I had to write this down, suffered from diphtheria, tuberculosis, smallpox, dysentery, malaria, tonsillitis, pneumonia, and epiglottitis. That's just a few of the ones that he suffered with in his life, which is, of course, inflammation of the epiglottis, the little flap. So
how old was he when he passed away? He was in his 60s, wasn't he?
I think he was 62, I believe.
Okay. And didn't part of his death come from they were bleeding him?
Yes.
Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's what they did.
It was a medical procedure back then. It was a stupid one.
Oh, big time. Hi, you're on the air.
Hi. Good morning. I finished my Alexander Hamilton book, and in the margins I kept writing, so like today, so many things that happened back then. Are similar kind of things that happen. But my one question with Alexander Hamilton and I want to get your opinion on our debt.
On national debt?
Our national debt. He just, Hamilton, what would he be saying today?
Well, I mean, Hamilton was a supporter of the idea the United States should keep some debt.
Yes.
Because again, basically the Bank of the United States is, the idea of that we can, one of Hamilton's, brainchild. But there is that point of, like in any situation with debt, is there a point when if your ability to pay exceeds your ability to create wealth? I mean, as long as the United States has a good economy, staying in debt. But I look at it going, we're $21 trillion now. I'd heard predictions in the past that there is a point with our GDP that about 22 trillion is it, and after that you're exceeding your ability to pay off your loan, and that happens, say, in Greece, and Greece's government went hell in a handbasket because it had to be bailed out by other nations. So obviously we shouldn't run as much as in debt, but now we'd be requiring getting Congress to actually be fiscally responsible, and again. There's a reason Congress has an approval rate of 18%.
Right.
But see, but it's also, and I didn't be crude on it. But it's our fault if you don't, throw the bums out if they don't want to do their jobs.
Well, they say they're going to run on it, but then they don't do it. Both sides.
Well,
it's like, but. Hamilton said the creation of debt should always be accompanied with the means to extinguish it.
The means to pay it off, exactly. You could argue the United States could pay off its debt. We do have enough of our annual GDP that if we cut our budget, by $1 trillion, we could pay off the debt in 20 years. And we could do that in theory. I mean, but the question is whether there's a will. This is a problem with both Republicans and Democrats. They've never met a tax they didn't like. And once you give them money, they don't want to give it back. Again, but that's almost a whole other argument. I agree, though. I think that we're playing a dangerous game with debt, because if the other side of that, if we suddenly have a big economic downturn, something happened in the world. Let's say the world market, the euro collapses. Well, the United States would take a tremendous hit financially, and all of a sudden, can we pay off our debts? Is our GDP going to be high enough to be considered to be solvent anymore?
Yeah, and I just think, I'm not saying we're not going to have debt, but get that trajectory going, the arrow going down instead of up.
It would be nice to see it. It's a fault of both sides of Congress at this point.
And it's spending, the Democrats want to spend, and the Republicans don't want to have tax. So how do you?
Yeah, there is a point where you're going to have you do have to have one or the other.
You have to have both.
Yeah, you do.
Have both to me. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. One of the things, like Alexander Hamilton, his life was shortened by a duel.
Oh, yeah.
I never figured out what that dueling business is.
Well, dueling is a matter of personal honor.
Yeah, but give me a break.
Most duels are not supposed. Duels with pistols are the ones that end up getting people killed. But very few people, when you look at duels with swords, you have to. When you kill someone with a pistol, it's probably a logical outcome of shooting at them. But if you kill someone with a sword, you have to make a choice to kill them because you can wound them.
Right.
You can
That's
bleed.
true. That's true.
And like I said, in that case, it's settling the matters with, sometimes I think, how much better would the world be if you could just simply go out and fight a little duel and the matter's over. Somebody gets cut.
Well, put some boxing gloves on and do it that way.
Yeah, well, I used to box, so I'd agree with that.
Yeah. Well, let's go to our listener line. Hi, you're on the air.
Yes, talking about military ranks, something I'm not too sharp on. They have a brevet general or brevet colonel. Does that mean honorary or temporary? And I'm still on the phone.
Uh-huh.
I'd care to address that subject, please.
I heard the term before. I think it's like emeritus using for like a professor. It's in one who has been that's being honored still, as I thought was what the brevet meant. But I could be mistaken. I'm not. Like I said, I'm not that familiar with the term.
Okay. And then deviate just a little bit towards
Can you turn your radio down because it's kind of...
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear ourselves back there.
Sorry, I've done it. It's off.
Okay, thanks.
You bet. Talking about the five-star generals, the MacArthur, Eisenhower, and everything. Eisenhower actually was a lieutenant colonel under MacArthur.
Oh, yes.
In Japan. But anyhow, it was not a very good relationship. But anyhow, later on when the five stars began being handed out, MacArthur had the senior data rank over Eisenhower and the rest of them. So when your data rank was a predominating factor on who was the real boss, and then when they decided to make Washington that honorary one, his data rank was before the other one, so he was the supreme general.
He would have been when they actually did it. It was just an honor for him because he's a man who's worthy of that honor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Super guest today, Doug.
Oh, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. What's interesting is that I had to do an interview with the Sergeant Major of the Army.
Okay.
And I've been around a lot of generals because we worked at Headquarters Company, and I was around Allied Supreme Commanders of NATO and that sort of thing. So I sat down with him, and he literally had officers that were basically his underlings. A captain was like his aide.
Right.
And everything, yes, Sergeant Major, no Sergeant Major, or Command Sergeant Major. And, I mean, this guy had power that I was shocked at how much power he had. He was like a general of the NCOs, if that makes sense.
And probably in a weird way, a general who actually probably would deserve the rank. Sometimes a lot of generals get their positions, and it can be as political much. Right. But if you're Sergeant Major of the Army, then you have gotten there because you have the ability to get stuff done. I mean, again, Armies sergeants do, in my assessment, officers are valued, but they don't always necessarily. If I were in a battlefield situation and I had a captain giving an order and a sergeant giving an order, I'd listen to the sergeant. Yeah, because he knows what. Because he if I want to come out alive, I want to listen to him. I don't really need give me a gunny sergeant or sergeant major or whatever. Give me any of those, and those are the ones who know what they're doing.
Well, we had a lieutenant general at Headquarters TASCOM in Worms, and he was hired from General Motors because he was involved in logistics and transportation, because TASCOM had the largest fleet of semi-trucks in the world because they transported everything from pencils to tanks, because you had 250,000 troops there of various kinds. And then you also had their dependents. So there was 500,000 people that they were serving. And so we had this huge, truck, whatever, collection of I don't know how many, 300, 400, some huge number of semi-trucks that traveled all over. And one of the reasons why he was given a command there was because of his expertise at General Motors.
The ability to actually get things done.
Yeah, and he was very well organized, but he started out as a full colonel and then worked his way up. Now, interesting. And he was like kind of a civilian in a general's outfit. Hi, you're on the air.
Hi, good morning. Can you talk about the president's decision on how he's going to build the border wall? I heard on the news this morning that Democrats are doing something to try to stop that. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
It's an unusual situation. What you're talking about is using the national emergency to do different things. First of all, most people aren't aware of the fact that presidents declare national emergencies a lot, actually. I mean, if memory serves me, Clinton had 14 national emergencies in his time.
What were some of them? I mean, just kind of an example of what we're talking about.
The funny thing about them is a lot of them are really kind of strange things. I mean, some of them they declare a national emergency to forbid the export of materials from Kuwait. And they put that in the category because what happened is in the 1970s, the National Emergency Act was put in place. National emergencies are considered something powers that the president can do under certain circumstances, and they defined it in law to allow them to be able to do certain things because of this, a national emergency. So, I mean, people have done it. I mean, the obvious one, the only time I know for a fact you can say it definitely was used in the right case would have been, I think, was September 14th, right after 9/11.
Oh, okay.
George Bush declared a national emergency at that time. But a lot of the times they're just simply matters of continuing. I mean, let's see, I think Bush had 11 and Obama had 13 times that he declared a national emergency. And I was reading the statutes of law over, going through the U.S. codes. And the president definitely has the right to do this. I mean, they can fight it if they want, but you guys made the law.
So he can propose it,
he can actually once he declares a national emergency according to the National Emergency Act, he can then have certain powers and authority based on that.
But if he take it to the Supreme Court, what does he still continue?
The Supreme Court could argue whether it was legal, but they're the only one who can stop it.
Oh, okay. So
Congress can stop it, repeal the law. Of course, they'd have to get that at a veto-proof majority. If not, it's going to come to the president. He's just going to veto it.
Let's go to our listener line. Hi, you're on the air.
Hey, when I was in the military, and I think when you were in too, Doug, we were referred to as the Armed Forces of the United States of America. My question is, when did we become the Uniformed Services? Because that's what it says today on every military card, ID card.
I'm trying to remember that. I've actually You're making a file try to open up in my brain because it's like I think it was in the Vietnam period when they changed it over. It was like 1972 around there. They changed the designation on that. That seems to be what I'm remembering. But you're gonna have to don't quote me on that one. But that would be it. You're right. It is. We used to be the
Uniformed Services sounds more like Meals on Wheels.
It does, isn't it? Horrible.
That's essentially what we've been doing for going around and building nations.
Well, and again, in the times, I never take anything away from soldiers because soldiers have a really, really hard job. But yeah, sometimes these soldiers are being used as political tools and being manipulated and used by, God save us from politicians trying to run the military.
Right. But that's kind of I kind of remember armed forces all the way through Reagan era, if I'm not mistaken.
I thought it was 72, but you're right. It could actually be. I'd have to. It's one of those situations. Hey, I'll go home and check it, and we'll talk about it next month.
The draft ended. I believe it was February of 1973, when citizen soldiers were. We had citizen soldiers then.
Right.
So virtually everybody who was in the Army was a United States citizen because we were drafted. A lot of us were drafted.
To be drafted.
The draftees were the ones that won all the wars.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
To a large extent.
And then it changed. Today we don't have citizen soldiers. Many of our servicemen are not U.S. citizens. That's what scares me the most.
But I think after they serve in the military, they should be.
Well, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them learn from our military, and then they go back to their countries, and then, you know.
I wouldn't. I would say. I think you're saying lot. I think you probably would use a better word would be some. I mean, I don't really have a problem with the idea if someone's willing to serve in the military of the United States, that, you know, they're willing to give them the consideration of granting them citizenship.
Yeah.
And they do have accelerated citizenship.
We're going to have to take a break. I'm past my break time. It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. 7:54 is the time, and of course you've got your YouTube channel. Now, what are some of the things you're working on that will come up here in the future? That
I'm going to do pieces on. Like I said, a lot of times there's a huge amount of ignorance. Like I said, I'm working on one on you know, talking about the origins of socialism and communism, and then I'm also going to do one on fascism. Also, people tend to throw the word fascist around and don't necessarily have any idea what the word actually means. And there's a sometimes epic amount of ignorance amongst, again, we're media right now. Radio is almost immune to this. You know, I think radio has to have a certain amount of truth in it. But sometimes I look at the ignorance of the broadcast media and get astonished by the fact they don't have any idea what they're talking about. Well,
the thing is most of the time news on radio has to be short, concise, and so they can't put in a lot of opinion.
Right.
So then you get the facts more. Let's go to our listener line. Hi, you're on the air.
Hey, I've got, if you haven't already thought of this, I have a perfect microcosm for socialism and how it doesn't work. If I'm correct on this, and it was Jamestown, and I think it was Jamestown, and it was John Smith, and there was a decree from the king that all for one and one for all, and all the food went into the pot. And I know that the history hasn't been changed because I read John Smith's diary, and he basically, there was complaints from the younger men that the older people weren't doing their part, and they starved that first winter. So if I'm correct on this, he decreed, or he told them, you're going to get a certain percentage now of your own production. And then the issues went away. And I thought, here they are, surrounded by nobody, starving to death. And socialism, even in that situation, failed to even feed them. And when he changed the rules and made it more of a
capitalistic, yeah.
Yes, and then all of a sudden, and you know, the other professor denies it ever happened, but I know it happened because I read his diary. And so I just thought, that's a perfect example of how socialism does not work.
And in doing the piece that I was doing on, like I said, I did the paper on it, I was going over my original origins on it and everything. And socialism is, the problem with it is that, it's been tried in over 40 nations, and everyone has ended up in tears and suffering in its people. I mean, there isn't any arguments against that. If you run a pure socialist, the problem with socialism is modern socialism slides into communism. It's the ultimate byproduct.
So what's an example of a country that was socialistic?
You mean, that it's been failed?
Yeah.
China, the USSR, Vietnam, North Korea.
So in other words, they weren't really communists, they were socialist.
But they always call it as socialism. When people look at it, they draw lines. Modern socialism comes from Marx and Engels' philosophies. And it's socialism that the ultimate expression of it eventually is the government, that you'll have a government to put it in place, and eventually that government will wither away because everyone will live in a
then that's communism when it reaches that point. Okay.
The problem is the government never withers away because what socialism is it's saying, we're going to share stuff, which means I'm going to take your extra and give it to somebody else. Well, the only way you can do that is with a government. And the only way you can do that, if the people don't consent, is by force.
Now, you could have a hybrid of that.
You can have, there's a difference between, you would look at, if you look at, say, charities. I mean, charities are a form of socialism. People take what they give and they give it to other people. Sure. But that's voluntary. The problem is when you create a socialist government, it no longer becomes voluntary. And if any case, the only thing that makes, even in our country here, we pay taxes, and you say, well, that in a way that money is being given and taken and other things. Yes. And why do we pay taxes? Well, because we're citizens, we should. But if we don't, it's what makes us pay it. It's force. Because if you don't pay your taxes long enough, people with guns will come and make you pay your taxes.
Or throw you in jail.
Right.
Hello?
Yes, am I correct on Jamestown?
Yes, I'm sorry, sir. Yeah, what you're talking about. There were some issues on that. I think you're right. I've read that diaries you talked about too. So I'm looking at it and going, I would agree with you on it. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I thought.
That's all right. By the way, the perfect example for socialism is Venezuela. They were the richest country in South America, and now they're starving to death.
Yeah, but he's a dictator too, though.
But all socialism always has
basically has a dictator.
It always has to have a dictator of some form. It's either a dictatorial group or a dictatorial individual. It always has to have it.
The socialism thing that's going on in America now will backfire and ultimately fail. It's not going anywhere.
No.
All right, we're going to have to wrap things up, and thank you for being with us. And once again, let people know where they can see your work.
Yeah, my YouTube channel is Arena of History. ARENA on YouTube. You can do a search for that, and then you can always look for my articles in the Senior Sunset Times.
All right. Well, we'll have you in again next month and find out what else is new that we can talk about.
If you wish to join the quest for knowledge, the battle for truth, please hit the like button, recommend my channel to others, and of course, subscribe. Thank you kindly.